The autumn rain fell like shards of ice upon the cobblestones of Greymont, turning the narrow streets into rivers of mud and misery. Sir Aldrich of Thornwall pulled his woolen cloak tighter around his shoulders as his destrier's hooves clattered against the slick stones, each step echoing through the nearly deserted marketplace. The war in the eastern provinces had ended 3 months prior, but its shadow still hung over the land like a funeral shroud. Merchants had shuttered their stalls early, and the few peasants who braved the weather moved with heads bowed, their faces gaunt with the kind of hunger that had become all too familiar in these troubled times. Aldrich had ridden to Greymont to collect taxes owed to his small holding, a keep that sat on the borderlands between the Duchy of Valmere and the wild forests that stretched endlessly northward. His was not a wealthy estate, merely a watchtower and a modest hall with enough land to support 24 families who worked his fields and tended his livestock. He was a knight of modest means, respected for his honor in battle, but possessing neither the gold nor the political connections that elevated other men to positions of greater power. His father had held these lands before him, and his grandfather before that, each generation serving faithfully but never rising beyond their station. Aldrich had made peace with this long ago, finding his purpose in the simple duties of protection and stewardship rather than in dreams of glory. As he guided his horse past the ancient fountain that marked the town centre, something caught his eye. Huddled against the stone base of the fountain, barely visible beneath a pile of soaked rags, was a child. The boy could not have been more than 10 summers old, his limbs thin as kindling, his skin stretched tight over sharp cheekbones that spoke of weeks without proper nourishment. His hair, matted and dark with grime, hung in his eyes, but those eyes themselves burned with a fierce intelligence that seemed incongruous with his wretched state. The child's hands clutched at his stomach, and even from atop his horse, Aldrich could hear the soft whimpering that escaped the boy's cracked lips. The knight had seen such sights before, too many times in the aftermath of war. Orphans littered the countryside like autumn leaves, their parents claimed by battle, plague, or starvation. Most nobles rode past without a second glance, their hearts hardened by the sheer impossibility of saving them all. What was one child against the tide of suffering that had swept across the realm? Yet something about this particular boy gave Aldrich pause. Perhaps it was the defiant tilt of the child's chin, even in his misery, or the way his eyes followed the knight's movement with a sharpness that suggested a mind still fighting against the body's surrender to death. Aldrich dismounted, his boots splashing in a puddle as he approached the fountain. The boy shrank back instinctively, his eyes widening with fear. Trust was a luxury that street children could not afford, especially when it came to armed men in positions of power. The knight raised his hands slowly, palms outward, in a gesture of peace. "Easy, lad," Aldrich said softly, his voice barely audible above the drumming rain. "I mean you no harm." The boy said nothing, but his eyes darted to the leather pouch that hung at Aldrich's belt, then quickly away. The hunger in that glance was so raw, so desperate, that it struck the knight like a physical blow. Without a word, Aldrich reached into his saddlebag and withdrew a cloth bundle. Inside was the bread and dried meat he had packed for his journey home, provisions that would see him comfortably back to his keep by nightfall. He knelt in the mud, heedless of his cloak, and extended the bundle toward the child. For a long moment, the boy did not move. His eyes searched Aldrich's face, looking for the trick, the cruelty that so often accompanied apparent kindness. When he found nothing but genuine concern, his thin fingers darted out and snatched the bundle with the speed of a starving animal. He tore into the bread, stuffing it into his mouth so quickly that he began to choke. Aldrich placed a gentle hand on the boy's shoulder, feeling the sharp ridge of his shoulder blade through the wet rags. "Slowly, child, slowly." "It will do you no good to choke on your salvation." The boy nodded, tears streaming down his face, mixing with the rain. He forced himself to chew, to breathe, though every instinct screamed at him to devour the food as quickly as possible before it could be taken away. As he ate, Aldrich studied him more carefully. Beneath the grime and the rags, there was something unusual about the child. His bearing, even in destitution, suggested he had not always been a street urchin. The way he held himself, the shape of his hands despite their filth, spoke of some better past, now lost to tragedy. "What is your name?" Aldrich asked. The boy swallowed hard, his throat working painfully. When he spoke, his voice was little more than a rasp. "Torin, my lord." "And your family, Torin? Where are they?" The boy's eyes dropped to the ground, and fresh tears came, though he tried to blink them away. "Gone, my lord. The fever took my mother last spring. My father died at the Battle of Redmere Field, or so the soldiers told us when they came through our village looking for new recruits. Redmere Field. Aldrich knew that battle well. He had fought there himself, had stood in the shield wall as wave after wave of enemy soldiers crashed against them like the sea against cliffs. Thousands had died that day, cut down in the mud, their blood turning the field into a crimson marsh. The victory had been costly, and the victory itself had been hollow, merely pushing the conflict into a stalemate that would likely erupt again come spring. "And you have been alone since then?" Torin nodded. "The village couldn't feed extra mouths. They gave me a week's worth of bread and told me to try my fortune in Greymont. That was 2 months ago, my lord. 2 months surviving on the streets, through the transition from summer to autumn, with winter's cruel grip fast approaching. It was a miracle the boy still lived." Aldrich felt a weight settle in his chest, that familiar burden of witnessing suffering he was powerless to address on any grand scale. Yet here, in this moment, he was not powerless. Here, there was one child, one life that he could touch, that he could alter. The knight made his decision without conscious thought, driven by an impulse that came from somewhere deeper than logic or careful consideration. "Can you ride, Torin?" The boy looked up, confusion and hope warring in his expression. "My lord?" "I asked if you can ride, if you can hold on to a saddle." I rode my father's plough horse once, before," he trailed off. "That will suffice." Aldrich stood and extended his hand. "Come, you will return with me to Thornwall Keep. There is work to be done, and I will have need of a stable boy who is willing to earn his bread honestly." For a moment Torin simply stared at the outstretched hand as if it were a vision, something too wonderful to be real. Then, with a sob that came from the very depths of his soul, he grasped it. Aldrich pulled the boy to his feet and lifted him onto the destrier saddle before mounting behind him. The child weighed almost nothing, a bundle of bones and will wrapped in rags. As they rode out of Greymont, heading north toward the dark line of forest that marked the road to Thornwall, Aldrich could feel the boy trembling against him, though whether from cold, exhaustion, or overwhelming emotion, he could not say. The ride took several hours, and by the time they reached the keep, full darkness had fallen. Thornwall stood on a low hill, its grey stone walls rising from the earth like a natural outcropping of rock. It was not an impressive fortress by noble standards, lacking the soaring towers and elaborate battlements of greater castles, but it was solid and defensible, built to withstand raids from the wild lands to the north, rather than to inspire awe in visiting dignitaries. Torches burned in iron sconces along the wall, their flames dancing in the wind that had risen with nightfall, carrying with it the scent of wood smoke and distant rain. As they approached the gate, the guards called out a challenge, then quickly raised the portcullis when they recognized their lord. In the courtyard beyond, servants emerged from the hall, curious about their master's late return and the strange cargo he carried. Aldrich dismounted and helped Torin down, steadying the boy when his legs nearly gave out beneath him. The journey had exhausted what little strength remained in his wasted body. "Ilara!" Aldrich called, and a moment later a woman emerged from the hall. She was his steward's wife, a capable woman of middle years who managed the household with quiet efficiency. Her eyes widened when she saw the bedraggled child at the knight's side. "My lord, this is Torin. He is orphaned, alone, and in need of care. See that he is bathed, fed properly, and given clean clothes. Find him a place in the servants' quarters. Tomorrow we will discuss his duties, but tonight see to his immediate needs." Ilara's expression softened immediately. She was a mother herself, and the sight of the starving boy clearly moved her. "Of course, my lord. Come, child. Let us get you warm and dry." Torin looked back at Aldrich, his eyes filled with a gratitude so profound it was almost painful to witness. The knight nodded once, a silent acknowledgement, and watched as Ilara led the boy into the hall. Only then did he allow himself to feel the exhaustion of the long day. He handed his horse's reins to a stable hand and followed them inside, his mind already turning to the mundane concerns of his estate, the taxes that still needed to be tallied, the reports from his bailiff about the autumn harvest. The great hall of Thornwall Keep was modest but comfortable, its walls hung with tapestries that depicted hunting scenes and battles from generations past. A fire roared in the central hearth, casting dancing shadows across the worn wooden tables where his household took their meals. Aldrich's own quarters were sparse, containing little more than a bed, a desk, and a chest for his belongings. He had never been a man who valued luxury, finding comfort instead in purpose and duty fulfilled. That night, as he lay in bed listening to the wind howl around the keep's stones, Aldrich thought about the boy. He wondered what Torin's life had been like before tragedy stripped everything away, wondered what potential might lie hidden beneath the layers of trauma and starvation. The knight had acted on impulse, driven by compassion rather than calculation, but now practical concerns began to surface. Could the boy truly be useful? Would the other servants accept him? More importantly, could Thornwall's limited resources support another mouth, especially with winter approaching and the autumn harvest having been less bountiful than hoped? Yet even as these doubts circled in his mind, Aldrich felt no regret. Whatever came of this decision, he had done what his conscience demanded. He had seen a child in desperate need and had responded with mercy. If that proved to be a mistake, then it would be an honorable one, and Aldrich had long ago decided that he would rather err on the side of compassion than live with a heart hardened by expedience. He drifted into sleep with that thought, unaware that his simple act of kindness had set in motion events that would change not only his life, but the fate of his entire holding. Morning came cold and bright, the storm having passed in the night to leave behind a crystalline sky unmarred by clouds. Aldrich rose early, as was his habit, and made his way to the hall to break his fast. He found Torin already there, sitting at one of the long tables with a bowl of porridge before him. The transformation was remarkable. Cleaned of grime and dressed in simple but serviceable clothes, the boy looked entirely different. His dark hair, now washed, fell in soft waves around a face that was delicate rather than weak, with high cheekbones and a strong jawline that would serve him well in manhood. His eyes, no longer dulled by starvation, were a striking shade of amber that caught the morning light streaming through the hall's narrow windows. "Good morning, Torin," Aldrich said, taking his seat at the head of the table. "I trust you slept well." The boy stood quickly, nearly knocking over his bowl in his haste to show proper respect. "Yes, my lord. Better than I have in many months. I do not have words sufficient to thank you for your kindness. Sit, lad, finish your meal. We will discuss your duties once you have eaten and had a chance to regain some strength. Ilara tells me you have a fever, nothing serious, but you will need rest before you begin work." "I am strong enough to work now, my lord. I do not wish to be a burden." Aldrich smiled at that, recognizing the fierce pride that drove the boy's words. "There is no burden in recovering your health. You will be of more use to me once you are truly well. For now, eat, rest, and grow accustomed to your new home." Before Torrin could respond, a commotion erupted in the courtyard beyond the hall. Raised voices, the sound of many feet, the nervous whinny of horses. Aldrich rose immediately, his hand instinctively going to where his sword would hang if he were armed. Through the hall's main entrance, he could see his guards gathering at the gate, their postures tense, their hands on their weapons. The knight strode quickly to the door and out into the courtyard, Torrin forgotten for the moment. What he saw beyond the gate froze him in his tracks. The road leading to Thornwall Keep, the same road he had travelled just yesterday, was filled with soldiers. Not a raiding party or a small patrol, but a full military force. At least 200 men by Aldrich's quick count. They were well equipped, bearing the livery of no house or lord that Aldrich recognized. Instead, their surcoats were a deep crimson, emblazoned with a golden phoenix rising from flames. At the head of this force rode a man who could only be a commander of significant rank. He sat his horse with the ease of one born to war, his armor gleaming even in the weak autumn sunlight. His face was weathered and hard, marked by old scars, but his eyes held a keen intelligence. Behind him the soldiers stood in perfect formation, their discipline evident in every aspect of their bearing. Aldrich's captain of the guard, a grizzled veteran named Marcus, appeared at his side. "My lord, they arrived not 10 minutes ago. They have made no hostile moves, but their commander requests an immediate audience with you. He says it is a matter of utmost urgency." 200 armed men outside his gate constituted an implicit threat, regardless of their stated intentions. Aldrich's mind raced through possibilities. Had some political situation changed overnight? Was he unknowingly harboring a criminal? Had his holding somehow become strategically important in a conflict he knew nothing about? None of it made sense. "Open the gate," Aldrich commanded. "But keep the men at arms ready. I will speak with their commander in the courtyard." Marcus nodded and gave the order. The portcullis rose with a grinding of chains, and the gates swung open. The commander rode forward alone, leaving his troops on the road, a gesture that seemed designed to show peaceful intent. He dismounted in the courtyard with practiced grace and approached Aldrich, stopping at a respectful distance before offering a formal bow. "Sir Aldrich of Thornwall, I presume?" "I am he. And you are?" "Captain Roland of the Phoenix Guard, in service to His Majesty King Godric III. The man's voice was deep and resonant, carrying the accent of the royal capital far to the south. "I apologize for the dramatic nature of our arrival, but I bring urgent tidings that could not wait for more conventional protocols." Aldrich's confusion deepened. The Phoenix Guard were the king's elite personal troops, answering only to the monarch himself. Their presence here, in this remote corner of the realm, was extraordinary. "I am at His Majesty's service, as always, but I confess I do not understand what matter could bring the Phoenix Guard to my modest holding." Captain Roland's expression shifted, something that might have been respect or perhaps sympathy crossing his features. "My lord, perhaps we should speak privately. The matter I must discuss concerns not just you, but someone currently under your roof." "Under my roof? I have no one here but my household and—" Aldrich's voice trailed off as a terrible possibility dawned on him. Slowly, he turned to look back at the hall, where Torrin stood in the doorway, his young face pale with an emotion Aldrich could not immediately identify. Fear, certainly, but also something else. Recognition. Understanding. "The boy," Aldrich said softly. "This is about Torrin, not Torrin," Captain Roland corrected gently. "His true name is Prince Torian of House Blackwood, third son of the late King Godric II, and currently 7th in line to the throne of our kingdom." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap's echo, reverberating through Aldrich's understanding of the world. A prince. He had rescued not a common orphan, but a member of the royal family. The implications cascaded through his mind in rapid succession. The civil war that had raged in the eastern provinces had not been a simple territorial dispute, but a conflict over succession. The king's brother had challenged young King Godric III's right to rule, claiming the old king's death had been suspicious. In the chaos that followed, the royal family had been scattered, with several of the old king's children disappearing into the countryside. Aldric turned fully now to face Torrin, or rather, Prince Torrin. The boy had descended the hall's steps and now stood in the courtyard, his posture completely transformed. Gone was the hunched, fearful street urchin. In his place stood a young man who carried himself with an innate dignity, despite his simple clothes and still too thin frame. Those amber eyes, which Aldric had thought merely striking, now seemed to hold depths of royal bearing. "Is this true?" Aldric asked, his voice rough with shock. Torrin nodded slowly. "I am sorry for the deception, my lord. When you found me yesterday, I was simply too grateful, too desperate to speak the truth. I thought—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I thought if you knew who I was, you might turn me away for fear of becoming embroiled in political matters, or worse, you might try to ransom me to my uncle's forces, who have been hunting me for months." Captain Roland stepped forward, his hand raised in a placating gesture. "The prince speaks truly about the danger he faced. Since the coup attempt, those loyal to the usurper have been searching for any remaining members of King Godric II's bloodline. The boy fled the capital with his tutor when the fighting began, but they were separated during an ambush 3 months past. We have been searching for Prince Torrin ever since, following rumors and hints across half the kingdom." "And how did you find him here?" Aldric asked. "One of my scouts was in Greymont yesterday, making inquiries. He witnessed a knight taking a street child onto his horse and questioned the townsfolk afterward. The descriptions they gave of the boy matched what we knew of the prince. We rode through the night to reach Thornwall, praying that our information was correct and that we had found him at last." Aldric felt as though the ground had shifted beneath his feet. His simple act of mercy had placed him at the center of a political maelstrom. He looked from the captain to the prince and back again, trying to process the sudden transformation of his circumstances. "And what happens now? You take the prince back to the capital." "With your permission and assistance, yes," Roland replied. "King Godric III has been desperate to find his younger brother. With Prince Torrin safely returned, the last of the pretender's claims to legitimacy will crumble. The war can finally end, and the kingdom can begin to heal." Aldric's eyes fixed on Torrin. The boy, no, the prince, met his gaze steadily. There was an apology there, but also a quiet strength that the knight was only now beginning to recognize. "You let me believe you were a peasant orphan." "I am an orphan," Torrin said softly. "My father is dead, murdered by his own brother's ambition. My mother perished from fever, as I told you, though she was the king's third wife, not a peasant woman. The rest of what I told you was true as well. I have been alone, starving, hunted. That you found me by a fountain in Greymont rather than in a palace does not change the essential truth of my situation. I was a boy in desperate need, and you helped me without thought of reward or recognition. You gave me food, shelter, and kindness when I had nothing. That makes you a better man than many who bear far greater titles." The sincerity in the young prince's voice was undeniable, and Aldric felt his initial shock beginning to give way to a strange sort of wonder. He had done nothing more than what any decent man should do, yet somehow that simple act had become entangled with the fate of kingdoms. It was absurd, humbling, and slightly terrifying all at once. "Captain Roland," Aldric said, turning back to the Phoenix Guard commander, "your men must be weary from riding through the night. Thornwall Keep cannot accommodate 200 soldiers, but we can offer what hospitality we have. Let your men make camp in the meadow beyond the keep, and you and your officers may take your ease in my hall. We should discuss the details of the prince's return to the capital. Roland bowed deeply. You have my thanks, Sir Aldrich. Your generosity and understanding in this matter will not be forgotten. As the captain turned to give orders to his men, Torien approached Aldrich. Up close, the prince seemed even younger than his years, the weight of his experiences showing in the shadows beneath his eyes. "My lord," he began, his voice barely above a whisper, "I know I have placed you in a difficult position." "If you are angry with me—" "I am not angry," Aldrich interrupted gently. "Surprised, certainly. Overwhelmed, perhaps, but not angry. You did what you had to do to survive, and survival is never dishonorable." He placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, the same gesture he had made yesterday by the fountain. "Besides, had you told me the truth, I likely would have thought you mad or delirious with fever. Things have a way of working out as they should." A tentative smile crossed Torien's face, the first genuine expression of happiness Aldrich had seen from him. "Thank you, my lord, for everything. I will not forget what you have done for me." The rest of that day passed in a blur of activity. Captain Roland and his officers met with Aldrich in the hall, explaining the political situation in exhaustive detail. The coup attempt by the old king's brother, Duke Morven, had nearly succeeded. The Duke had seized several key fortresses and had gained the support of a significant portion of the nobility, those who felt the young King Godric III was too inexperienced to rule effectively. The war had dragged on for months, with neither side able to gain a decisive advantage. But now, with Prince Torien's return, the balance would shift decisively. The prince's survival proved that the royal line remained strong, that King Godric's claim to the throne was legitimate and divinely sanctioned. Many of Duke Morven's supporters had joined him only reluctantly, swayed by arguments about the need for experienced leadership. With a living prince to point to, evidence that the gods favored the rightful king, those wavering supporters would likely return to the fold. "The prince's return will end the war," Roland explained, his finger tracing routes on a map spread across Aldrich's desk. Duke Morven's entire strategy depended on eliminating all of the old king's children, making himself the only viable heir. With Prince Torien alive and well, that strategy collapses. The Duke will have no choice but to sue for peace or face complete defeat as his allies abandon him. Aldrich listened carefully, asking questions when necessary, trying to understand the complex web of alliances and grievances that had torn the kingdom apart. It was so far removed from his own simple existence, this world of courtly intrigue and dynastic struggle. Yet he had become a part of it, whether he wished to or not, by extending a hand to a starving child. As evening approached, a feast was prepared in the prince's honor, though Aldrich insisted it be a modest affair, befitting both his limited resources and the somber circumstances that had brought them together. The hall filled with the Phoenix Guard's officers, along with Aldrich's own household. Torien sat at Aldrich's right hand, the place of honor, though he ate little and spoke less. The day's revelations had clearly exhausted him, both physically and emotionally. When the meal concluded and most of the guests had departed to their respective quarters, Aldrich found himself alone with the prince in the hall's upper gallery, looking out over the darkened countryside. The stars shone brilliantly overhead, uncounted thousands of them scattered across the heavens like diamonds on black velvet. "I used to watch the stars from the palace observatory," Torien said quietly. "My tutor, Master Aldwin, taught me to recognize the constellations, to navigate by their positions. He said a prince should understand the heavens as well as the earth, for both are part of the kingdom he might one day help govern." The boy's voice caught. "I do not know if Master Aldwin survived the ambush. I ran, as he commanded me to do, but I heard him fighting behind me, buying time with his life." "It is a hard thing," Aldrich said softly, "to owe your survival to another's sacrifice. The guilt can be crushing if you let it, but the best way to honor such sacrifice is to live well, to make something meaningful of the life that was preserved." Torien turned to look at the night, and in the starlight his young face seemed ancient, carved from marble. "How do you bear it? The weight of duty, of knowing that your actions affect the lives of those who depend on you?" I try to do the next right thing," Aldrich replied simply. "I cannot save everyone. I cannot prevent all suffering or injustice, but I can choose in each moment to act with honor and compassion. Sometimes that is enough. Sometimes it is all we can do. Is that why you helped me? Because it was the right thing to do?" "I helped you because you were a child who needed help. Everything else, all of this," Aldrich gestured at the camp beyond the keep's walls, where hundreds of soldiers' fires now burned like earthbound stars, "is incidental. I would do the same again, knowing what I know now, because the alternative would be to ride past suffering I have the power to address. That is not the man I wish to be." Torian was silent for a long moment, absorbing these words. When he finally spoke again, his voice carried a new quality, something harder and more resolute. "When I return to the capital, when I stand beside my brother and help him reclaim the kingdom, I will remember this lesson. I will remember that true nobility lies not in titles or crowns, but in the choice to act with mercy when it would be easier to look away." The two stood together in companionable silence, watching the stars wheel slowly overhead. Tomorrow, the Phoenix Guard would escort Prince Torian back to the capital, back to a world of politics and power that Aldrich could scarcely imagine. But tonight, for these few hours, they were simply two souls who had found each other in the darkness, connected by a moment of simple kindness that had rippled outward to touch the fate of nations. Morning came too quickly. The Phoenix Guard broke camp with military efficiency, their formations assembling on the road as the first light of dawn touched the eastern horizon. Torian emerged from the keep, dressed in new clothes that Captain Roland had brought, fine garments bearing the royal crest, transforming him visually into the prince he truly was. Yet when he approached Aldrich to bid farewell, there was nothing formal or distant in his manner. "I wish I could stay longer," the prince said. "Thornwall Keep feels more like a home than the palace ever did. Perhaps because here I was valued simply for being a person in need, rather than for the blood that flows in my veins." "You will always be welcome here," Aldrich replied. "Prince or pauper, should you ever find yourself in need of refuge or simply respite from the burdens of your station, my gate will be open to you." Torian embraced the knight then, a quick, fierce hug that spoke volumes. When he pulled back, there were tears in his eyes, though he blinked them away rapidly. "I will not forget you, Sir Aldrich of Thornwall, and I will ensure that your kindness is rewarded. The kingdom will know what you have done." "I need no reward," Aldrich said firmly. "I did nothing more than any honorable man would do." Perhaps that is true," Captain Roland interjected, having approached during their conversation. "But honor such as yours deserves recognition nonetheless. The king will wish to thank you personally, I am certain. You have helped end a war and saved his brother's life. Such deeds do not go unnoticed." Aldrich simply nodded, uncomfortable with the praise but wise enough not to argue further. As Torian mounted the horse that had been prepared for him, the assembled soldiers raised their voices in a cheer that echoed off the keep's walls. The Phoenix Guard's standard was raised high, and with Captain Roland at their head and Prince Torian riding beside him, the column began to move, heading south toward the capital and toward the destiny that awaited the young prince. Aldrich watched until they disappeared from view, swallowed by the forest that lined the southern road. Only then did he turn back to his keep, to the familiar routines of his life, the duties that awaited him. Yet something had changed, some subtle shift in the way he perceived his place in the world. He had always known that small actions could have large consequences, but he had never before witnessed it so dramatically, so immediately. The weeks that followed brought news from across the kingdom, carried by merchants and messengers who passed through the region. Prince Torian's return had indeed turned the tide of the war. Duke Morven's coalition had fractured almost immediately, with lord after lord returning their loyalty to King Godric III. The Duke himself had been captured attempting to flee to the neighbouring kingdom of Ralmark and was currently imprisoned in the capital, awaiting trial for treason. More personally relevant, a royal courier arrived at Thornwall Keep 6 weeks after the Phoenix Guard's departure. He bore a letter sealed with the king's own signet, along with a small chest. Aldric opened the letter first, reading the elegant script with growing astonishment. The king thanked him profusely for preserving Prince Torian's life, calling Aldric's actions nothing short of providential. More than gratitude, however, the letter contained concrete rewards. Aldric's holding was to be expanded significantly, encompassing 3 additional villages and a grant of woodland that would double his territory. Additionally, the king awarded him a substantial sum of gold from the royal treasury, enough to ensure Thornwall's prosperity for years to come. But perhaps most significantly, the king appointed Aldric as the royal warden of the Northern March, a position that came with both prestige and genuine authority to keep the peace in the borderlands. The chest contained the badges and regalia of his new office, along with a personal letter from Prince Torian himself. The prince's letter was shorter but no less heartfelt, expressing his continued gratitude and his hope that they would meet again soon. He described his life in the capital, the challenges of readjusting to courtly existence after months of living as a fugitive, and his determination to become a prince worthy of the second chance he had been given. Aldric read both letters several times, then carefully placed them in his desk's drawer. The rewards were generous, almost overwhelming, but they did not change the fundamental truth of what he had done. He had helped a child in need. That the child happened to be a prince was incidental. The real gift was not the gold or the lands or the title, but rather the knowledge that his choice to act with compassion had mattered, had made a difference not just to one boy, but to an entire kingdom. As winter settled over Thornwall Keep, bringing with it the harsh cold and deep snows that characterized the season in the northern lands, Aldric found himself thinking often about that rainy afternoon in Greymont. How easily he might have ridden past the fountain, too preoccupied with his own concerns to notice the huddled figure sheltering there. How close Torian had come to perishing, unknown and unmourned, his death potentially prolonging the civil war for years as his uncles searched in vain for the rival claimants to eliminate. The thought haunted Aldric in quiet moments, a reminder of how fragile fate truly was, how the trajectory of history could hinge on something as simple as one man's decision to stop and offer aid to a stranger. It reinforced his belief that every life mattered, that every opportunity to do good should be seized regardless of the apparent insignificance of the act. Spring came eventually, as it always did, melting the snows and coaxing new growth from the earth. With it came another visitor to Thornwall Keep, though this one was expected. Prince Torian arrived with a small escort, travelling incognito for the most part, dressed as a minor noble rather than in the full regalia of his rank. He looked different than he had during his brief stay the previous autumn. He had gained weight, filling out into the healthy frame of a growing boy, and his bearing had changed, acquiring the polish and confidence that came with restored status and security. But when he greeted Aldric, his smile was genuine and warm, devoid of any formal distance. "My Lord Warden," he said with a slight bow, "I hope I have not come at an inconvenient time." "Your Highness," Aldric replied, returning the bow. "You are always welcome here. Please dispense with the formalities. I am simply Aldric, and you are the boy I shared my supper with by a fountain." Torian laughed, a sound that had been absent during his previous visit. "I would like that very much. I spend all my days surrounded by protocol and ceremony at court. To have a place where I can simply be Torian, rather than Prince Torian, is a precious gift." The prince stayed for 3 days, and in that time Aldric came to know him better. Torian was intelligent and thoughtful, with a keen interest in history and statecraft that boded well for his future role in the kingdom's governance. But he also retained a humility and groundedness that seemed directly attributable to his experiences living on the streets. He had seen the worst that life could offer, had experienced genuine suffering and fear, and those experiences had shaped him in ways that a traditional royal upbringing never could have. On the final evening of his visit, they again found themselves in the upper gallery, looking out over the lands that now comprised Aldrich's expanded holding. The fields were being prepared for planting, and in the distance they could see peasants working the earth, their figures small against the vastness of the landscape. "My brother asked me to convey an invitation," Torian said, breaking a comfortable silence. "He wishes you to visit the capital, to be formally recognized before the court for your service to the crown. There will be a ceremony, honors bestowed, that sort of thing." Aldrich grimaced slightly. "I am not much for ceremonies and courts, Your Highness. My place is here, managing these lands and protecting the people who depend on me." "I told him you would say that," Torian replied with a knowing smile, "but I hope you will reconsider. Not for the honors themselves, but because your story deserves to be told. In a kingdom still healing from civil war, people need to be reminded that simple goodness still exists, that honor and compassion have not been entirely consumed by political ambition. Your example could inspire others." Aldrich considered this. The prospect of traveling to the capital, of being paraded before the court like some curiosity, held little appeal. But if his story could indeed serve some greater purpose, if it could encourage others to act with mercy rather than indifference, then perhaps the discomfort would be worthwhile. "I will think upon it," he said finally, "and I will send word to your brother of my decision." Torian nodded, accepting this. "That is all I ask. Whatever you decide, know that you have already given me something far more valuable than any ceremony could ever provide. You gave me hope when I had none, kindness when I expected only cruelty. You saved my life, Sir Aldrich, and in doing so, you saved countless others who would have perished if the war had continued. That is a legacy that will endure long after both of us are dust." The prince's words stayed with Aldrich long after Torian departed the next morning, heading back to the capital and to the complex world of politics and power that awaited him there. As Aldrich went about his daily duties, resolving disputes between villagers, inspecting the spring planting, ensuring that his expanded territory was being properly administered, he reflected on how profoundly his life had changed from a single, spontaneous decision. He had not sought greatness or recognition. He had simply tried to live according to the principles his father had instilled in him, to be a man of honor and compassion regardless of the circumstances. That this had led to such dramatic consequences was both humbling and slightly bewildering. Yet Aldrich recognized that this was perhaps the true lesson in all of it. You could not control outcomes, could not predict how your actions would ripple outward into the world. All you could do was make the best choice available in each moment and trust that doing so would lead, eventually, to good. Months later, Aldrich did travel to the capital, accepting the king's invitation despite his initial reluctance. The ceremony was as grand and uncomfortable as he had feared, with nobles he had never met singing his praises, and the king bestowing upon him additional honors that seemed excessive for what Aldrich still considered a simple act of decency. But he endured it with as much grace as he could muster, understanding that this was not truly about him, but rather about what his story represented to a kingdom desperately trying to rediscover its moral center. The high point of the visit came not during the public ceremonies, but in a private audience with King Godric III and Prince Torian. The king, who was barely older than Aldrich himself, spoke with surprising candor about the burden of the crown and the difficulty of making decisions that affected thousands of lives. He thanked Aldrich not just for saving his brother, but for reminding him that leadership was ultimately about service, about putting the needs of others before personal ambition. "You did not help my brother because you knew he was a prince," the king said. "You helped him because he was a child in need. That is the kind of nobility that matters, the kind that our realm desperately needs. I hope that as I rebuild this kingdom, I can rule with the same instinctive compassion that guided your actions that day." It was, Aldrich reflected later, the greatest compliment he had ever received. To think that his example, his simple adherence to basic decency, might influence how a king governed his realm was almost too much to comprehend. Yet it also reinforced something fundamental about the nature of power and responsibility. Kings might rule from thrones, might command armies and issue decrees, but the foundation of any just society rested on countless small acts of kindness and mercy carried out by ordinary people in their daily lives. Aldrich returned to Thornwall Keep after several weeks at court, grateful to be back among familiar surroundings and away from the intensity of life in the capital. He resumed his duties as Warden of the Northern March, settling into the expanded responsibilities that came with his new position. The years that followed were peaceful ones, the kingdom having been exhausted by war and eager for stability. Aldrich administered his territory fairly and well, earning a reputation for wisdom and justice that extended far beyond the borders of his holdings. Prince Torien visited regularly over the years, their friendship deepening despite the vast difference in their stations. Aldrich watched the boy grow into a man, saw him take on increasing responsibilities within the kingdom's administration. Torien never forgot the lessons of his time on the streets, and he carried those lessons into every decision he made, every policy he advocated for. When hunger threatened the eastern provinces during a particularly harsh winter, it was Prince Torien who led the relief efforts, personally overseeing the distribution of grain from the royal stores. When a plague broke out in the southern cities, he was there among the physicians and healers, refusing to let his royal status excuse him from the difficult work of caring for the sick. The prince often credited Aldrich's example as the inspiration for his actions, though Aldrich consistently deflected such praise. "You were already a good person," he would say. "I simply happened to be there when you needed help. What you have done with your life since then is entirely your own achievement." But privately, Aldrich took quiet satisfaction in seeing how Torien had developed, how that starving, desperate child had transformed into a leader of genuine wisdom and compassion. It validated everything Aldrich believed about human nature, about the potential that existed in every person, if only they were given the chance to realize it. As Aldrich grew older, his hair silvering and his steps slowing, he found himself increasingly reflective about the strange trajectory of his life. He had never sought adventure or glory, had been content with his modest holding and simple duties. Yet fate had placed him at a crucial juncture of history, had given him the opportunity to make a difference in ways he could never have imagined. The key, he realized, had been his readiness to act, his willingness to extend help, even when it seemed insignificant. How many people, he wondered, walked past opportunities to do good every day, dismissing them as too small to matter or too inconvenient to address? How different might the world be if everyone chose to act with compassion in those small moments? One act of kindness could not change the world, perhaps, but it could change one person's world, and that person might go on to change others, creating ripples that spread far beyond the original act. It was this philosophy that Aldrich tried to instill in the young people of his territory, in the knights and squires who trained under his supervision, in the children who came to learn letters and numbers from the tutor he employed. He told them the story of how he met Prince Torien, not to glorify himself, but to illustrate a principle. That greatness was not found in grand gestures or heroic battles, but in the consistent choice to do the right thing, especially when it was difficult or seemingly inconsequential. The years turned into decades, and Aldrich's life moved toward its inevitable conclusion. He had lived well and fully, had served his people with honor, had maintained friendships that transcended class and station. When illness finally claimed him in his 63rd year, it was Prince Torian, now middle-aged himself and serving as his brother's chief advisor, who rode north to attend his funeral. The prince delivered a eulogy that left few eyes dry among the assembled mourners. He spoke of a knight who had saved a kingdom by saving a single child, who had demonstrated that true nobility required no crown or title. He revealed details of that day in Greymont that he had never shared publicly, describing his absolute desperation, his certainty that he would die alone and forgotten in the streets. And he spoke of the moment when a stranger dismounted in the rain and offered not just food but dignity, treating a filthy street child with the same respect one might show a lord. "Sir Aldrich of Thornwall taught me the most important lesson I have ever learned," Torian said, his voice thick with emotion. "He taught me that we are measured not by what we do when others are watching, not by our grand gestures or public proclamations, but by what we do in the small, private moments when it would be easier to do nothing. He saw a child suffering and could not ride past. That simple act of conscience changed my life, changed the course of this kingdom's history, and changed me in ways I am still discovering. I strive every day to be worthy of the second chance he gave me, to honor his memory by living as he lived, with honor, compassion, and unwavering commitment to doing what is right." Aldrich was laid to rest on a hillside overlooking Thornwall Keep, in a place where he had often gone to think, to watch the sunset paint the western sky in shades of gold and crimson. A simple stone marked his grave, bearing his name and dates, and a single line that Prince Torian had insisted upon: "He helped when he could have ridden past." Chap! In the years that followed, that grave became something of a pilgrimage site, visited by those who had heard the story of the knight and the prince. People came to pay respects, to draw inspiration from the example of a man who had lived with integrity, to remind themselves that their own small acts of kindness mattered. The story was told and retold, embellished and simplified, taking on the quality of legend, even though it was firmly rooted in historical fact. But the truest legacy of Aldrich's life was not found in stones or stories, but in the countless lives touched by his example. Prince Torian continued to serve the kingdom with distinction, eventually becoming known as Torian the Good, a ruler who placed compassion and justice above personal ambition. He established orphanages and systems of poor relief throughout the realm, ensuring that no child would have to survive on the streets as he once had. And he made certain that in every school and monastery the story of Sir Aldrich was taught, held up as an example of what one person could accomplish simply by choosing to care. The kingdom prospered in those years, the wounds of civil war gradually healing, replaced by a sense of common purpose and shared humanity. Scholars in later generations would point to multiple factors that contributed to this golden age of peace and prosperity, from economic reforms to diplomatic initiatives. But those who looked deeper, who understood the subtle ways that culture shaped a society, recognized that much of it could be traced back to a simple transaction by a fountain in Greymont, where a knight had given bread to a starving child, and in doing so had planted seeds of compassion that would bloom for generations. The story of Aldrich and Torian endured, passed down through the ages, adapted to different contexts, but never losing its essential message, that kindness matters, that compassion is never wasted, that the small choices we make in seemingly insignificant moments can ripple outward to touch lives we will never know. It became a touchstone for the kingdom's moral identity, a story parents told their children, that priests included in their sermons, that bards sang in taverns and great halls alike. And perhaps that is the greatest legacy any person can leave, Not monuments or titles, not wealth or conquest, but a living example of how to be human in the best sense of that word. Uldric had asked nothing more than to live honorably and to help when help was needed. In achieving that modest goal, he had accomplished something far greater than he ever imagined, proving that sometimes the most profound heroism lies not in grand gestures, but in the simple act of extending a hand to someone who needs it. The rains would continue to fall on the cobblestones of Greymont, washing away the daily grime, and children would continue to gather by the old fountain, laughing and playing in the water. Some of them would know the story of what happened there generations ago when a knight chose compassion over convenience. And knowing that story, perhaps they would look with kinder eyes at those less fortunate, understanding that within each person, however humble or broken they might appear, might be hidden someone extraordinary, someone whose life could change the world if only given the chance. That was Uldric's gift to the kingdom. Not just the saving of a prince, but the planting of an idea, a seed of kindness that grew into a forest of compassion, sheltering countless souls in its shade. It was, in the end, the best thing any person could hope to achieve, and it all began with one simple choice on one rainy afternoon when a knight decided not to ride past. Thank you so much for listening to this story from Medieval Stories. If you enjoyed this tale of compassion, honor, and unexpected destiny, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more epic medieval narratives. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. What would you have done in Sir Uldric's position? Have you ever witnessed or experienced a small act of kindness that had unexpected consequences? Share your stories with us, and let's keep the spirit of this tale alive in our own lives. Until next time, may your own small acts of kindness ripple outward to touch the world in ways you cannot imagine.